course, last year we covered the Holocaust, and we kind of finished with a little view into the post-Holocaust period with the DPs and all the rest of it, but that was just to make it in the old Jewish tradition of not ending on such a sad note. But tonight I'd like to pick up from that point. And as you know, if you read, what I would like to cover this year, however superficially, is a period of 4 years, but what a 4 years in Jewish history. And this, of course, as you already know, is the period that came right after the Second World War, which culminated in the establishment of the State of Israel and all the problems that triggered. It goes without saying that you and I live in a world today in which the Arab-Israeli conflict simply dominates everything. And at its core, it's an argument over history. And at its core, it's an argument over different versions of the narrative, so to speak. Was Israel conceived in sin, or is Israel a glorious and triumphant accomplishment? I'm sorry to say this, did the Holocaust happen or did it not happen? These are real issues. They shouldn't be, but these are real issues out there in the world today. Believe you me, I always bring this up as an example, although I wish I was not able to. Do the majority of the people in the world today believe that 9/11 happened because Israel did it, or do they believe it was because of a bunch of Islamic terrorists? It is what it is. That's the crazy conspiracy kind of world we live in. When we deal, therefore, with the period 1945 to 49, very controversial. And for us here, it's controversial in two senses because we have the external side of the Arab-Israeli conflict and all the issues that were generated by the unexpected events of 1945 to 49. And then we have the internal Jewish conflict because the big dividing line among Jewry today, whether here or Israel or anywhere else, is the religious one. And this in many ways goes back once again to the unusual circumstances, really screwball circumstances, I'm going to argue, that before I'm finished this series, that characterize the rise of the issue of religion and orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy and all that kind of business, particularly in Israel and elsewhere, which have led to quite unexpected consequences, as you know. All this has its origins in the years 45 to 49, the late 40s. It's quite a transitional and remarkable period in that regard. And so without any further ado, let's get right into it. The war, of course, ended in May of 1945. I mean, totally ended. Hitler was dead. The Germans were completely defeated. Germany didn't exist. It was totally occupied by the Allied armies, the American army, the British army, the Russian army, of course, and a little bit the French, and divided up actually into occupation zones. There was no German government. The German army was dissolved. There was no German money. Complete defeat. And therefore, the hurricane was over. Last year, I used this kind of terminology. We in Baltimore recently went through some hurricanes and things like this. It really has this characteristic to me, because for 5 years, the Shoah raged, from 40 to 45 more or less, and of course it caused horrible destruction, and then it went away. Right? I mean, on May 5th, May 6th, 1945, it was like there had never been such a thing like this before. It was over. But as we all know, even when the hurricane is over, then you survey the wreckage. And what did Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people as such, what could they notice in May of 1945, when it's all over and now time comes up to count up the damage? I don't like to engage in kind of macabre arithmetic, but when else are you going to hear the actual numbers that occurred in the 1940s? I mean, how many did we actually lose when you get down to it? As best as I can figure, the actual numbers, if you start toting up, of how many people Hitler actually killed, the Nazis killed during the years 39 to 45, as part of what you and I today generally call the Holocaust, in addition to the numbers that were killed by their allies. I mean, the Romanians killed a couple 100,000. That's a lot, okay? And some other countries did similar kinds of numbers. If you count them all up, as best as I can tell, it comes out to 5.5 million, 5.5 million. But I'm not finished. Oops, there you go. Take a look at those numbers. This is the amount that actually happened by shootings, gas chambers, extermination camps, whether the Romanians shot a lot of people, or the Germans did, or the Lithuanians, or the Poles, that kind of thing. But it's not over. Look at the second line there. In addition, you have to throw an extra 250,000 because 500,000 Jews fought in the Russian army in the Second World War. That's a lot. Believe me, Israel wished they had that kind of numbers in 1948. 500,000 Jews fought in the Red Army, and 200,000 were killed. Do you count that as part of the Holocaust? I don't know. I'm not getting in one of these kind of hair-splitting debates. I just know that the Jewish people lost this number. I'm not finished, of course, right? Because you can see, in 1939, in that short, bloody, and brutal campaign, 30,000 Jews were killed in the Polish army fighting for Poland. And Poland went down the line. So it's 5.5, 200, another 30. Then it gets kind of tricky, because as you can see over here, about 500,000 Jews fought in the U.S. Armed Forces in the Second World War. And let's put it this way: they were in the U.S. Armed Forces. Some fought in combat. Some, ran the general store and camp, whatever, in Georgia. But the fact of the matter is that in the United States Armed Forces, 10,000, 11,000 were killed. I couldn't figure out in this past week exactly how many was killed fighting the Japanese, the Germans. So it's probably half of that. It's a 5,000 here, 5,000 there. Similar numbers, as you can see, in the British Army, a few thousand were killed. You start adding in the Canadians, the French, this, that, and the other, and you get the general idea of what I'm talking about. And so if you start really toning up the numbers, it's like 5.750, right? 5.75 million. Except that we're not finished there either, because, unfortunately, as many know, plenty died after the war from the starvation. Plenty of Jews were too far gone to be saved. Plenty of Jews tragically died because the GIs, with the best intentions in the world, gave them a candy bar or a sandwich or something like this, and the person didn't realize that you can't eat this, and it killed them, and so forth. This happened quite common. I spoke to a friend of mine this past week who's a specialist in Holocaust matters, and he said in Buchenwald or Bergen-Belsen, one of these places, 18,000 in one place that died after the war. And so you start working out the numbers, you end up with 30, 40,000, something like that, I don't know exactly, of Jews who perished after the liberation. Me, myself, and I think I mentioned last year. My father was 90% dead. He weighed 80 pounds, something like that, and he'd been a strong person. He was 80 pounds, and his body wasn't working. He couldn't assimilate food. He ate something, it went out right away. And he was gone. He's one of the lucky ones, otherwise I wouldn't be here, that the U.S. Army hospital was able to save him. Some will remember the famous story in the Gemara of the Rabbi of Tzadok, who was so starved that when the Roman doctor wanted to cure him, he had to do, if you remember the story, tiny bit the first day, a little bit more the second day. And they gave him a little water with, I think the Gemara says, a grain of flour or something like that, a little bit of flour, and the next day a little bit more, meaning you got to know what you're doing. Otherwise, so in my particular case, I'm here, so that means it worked. But for every person like that, there are many that did not work. So my point is, if you want to do the actual numbers, as best as I can figure out, it's 5.8 million. It's not a matter of splitting hairs, but we should once in a while hear what the actual facts are. This is what world Jewry was looking at as having lost in the wake of the show, in the wake of the Holocaust, whether it happened through this way or happened that way. Now, tonight I'm trying to take a Klal Yisrael kind of approach, meaning I'm trying to look at how did the Jewish people, if there's such an entity, how did this look at the end of the Second World War? And the first fact that jumps out is that there had been, as far as I can see, 4 major centers of Jewry, and now there were 3. 4 significant centers of Jewish population, and centers that really mattered, and then there are the others. In Jewish history, and even today, it's quantity wedded to quality, correct? There are places in the world in which there are sometimes fairly large, relatively large Jewish populations, but nothing Jewish really happens over there. They haven't contributed anything to Jewish culture. It didn't emerge as a center of anything. I'm not against them, it's just what it is. And then there are other places which sometimes could even be smaller. And yet there's a Jewish life is vibrant, and as I say, they're very deep into culture, whether it's religious culture or other culture, and it's significant as cooking. Before the war, before Hitler, obviously the most significant Jewish community by far was European Jewry. Right? I don't think there's no question about that. And now it was gone. The European Jewry had been the most Jewish community, quantity, but certainly quality. All Jewish culture came out of the European Jews. In fact, what you had in this country, and even in Israel, was derivative. It was all taken out of, I would even say, Eastern and Central Europe. Western Europe was kind of decadent and didn't do anything interesting in terms of Jewry. Central and Eastern Europe was where everything came from, whether religious or secular. All the isms, whether you want Hasidism, right? You want Shivaism, or do you want Zionism, or socialism, or Bundism, or Yiddishism, or any of the others? Notice all the new approaches, good and bad, smart and dumb, emerged out of this incredibly creative mass of people. I mean, they had their dummies too, but they had an unbelievable amount of creativity emerging out of there, all killed. This, of course, is the big effect, and the permanent effect of Jews. Poland, if you understood as Eastern Europe in general, had been the heart of Jewish Jewry, I don't know, close to 1,000 years, or very, very long. And certainly Rov Minyan and Rov Binyan of Klal Yisrael. I mean, let me put it this way: all the American Jews come from Eastern Europe, and even the few relatively that come from Germany, half of them came from Eastern Europe originally, as I described in earlier talks. All gone. Hitler destroyed the seed bed. Furthermore, Eastern European Jewry had been the only Jewry that I know of that had a baby boom. American Jewry has not had a baby boom. The Jewish population in the world has not really increased from 1945 till today, which is pretty sad. It's the, so to speak, what they call the Second Holocaust. Numbers should be double what, under ordinary circumstances, or at least what they were in 1960-some years ago, and it hasn't happened. That's typical, unfortunately. What was atypical was the Eastern European Jewry, which if you followed over the 15, 16, 17, 18, and 1900s, had a relatively large Jewish populations, which is why their overflow was able to populate America and the British Empire and South Africa and Israel and all the other places, and still have plenty left over. And this is exactly what Hitler exterminated. This is exactly what he physically shot and gassed. And we've not recovered. Okay, we've not recovered. So obviously, this was a devastating business. Now, as Jewry contemplated the fact that their most important center was now gone, they also faced, for the first time in public consciousness, the actual physical images. When the American Army and the British Army came and opened what you and I call the concentration camps, even though I tried to explain later, they're not exactly really the concentration camps. The real killing centers were the ones that were done farther east. But as a matter of history, in terms of public consciousness, April and May 1945 are absolutely decisive. The Russian army, much earlier in the war, conquered most of Poland. And at that time already, they found the extermination camps in Majdanek and Belzec and Chelmno and places like that, where millions of Jews had been exterminated, and the Germans tried to hide it, but there was still plenty left over. And these were put out in films shown in this country in 1944-45. It didn't register with the public. It's very fascinating from a advertisement person's point of view. You can see something and it hits you, and then sometimes it doesn't hit you. You understand? And I guess Americans figure like this: stuff coming out of Russia, Eastern Europe, is all that dead. We're not paying attention to it. I mean, they had the same pictures of the emaciated survivors and all the rest of it. But when Americans came, your father and mine, your brother and mine, and they actually saw this kind of business, then it was a completely different story. And the discovery of what the Germans had done in April and May of 1945 is an iconic moment, a landmark moment in the history of Western consciousness, and may I say the history of American consciousness. I don't know if I mentioned this story, but if I did, I'll mention it again. A couple of years ago, I was visiting somebody in the hospital when I was driving back, about 5 years ago, something like that. When I was driving back, happened to listen, I guess it was NPR or something like that, and I heard this lady giving a talk about her father, and she wasn't Jewish, she had a southern accent, and her father had been in Nordhoff, one of the U.S. Army guys liberated the Nordhoff concentration camp, and came back scarred. And he had nightmares for the rest of his life, but he wouldn't talk about it. And she went on and on about this. Laura Bush. Yeah. Then you say like this, her father was in the service. He was a GI. Some of these guys end up in these places. And they came back. You understand what I'm saying? I'll tell you another story. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2004 maybe, I took some high school kids to Washington in the Library of Congress. They had a big display, I think it was 350 years of American Jewry, something like that. And so it was cute, and it was well done technologically, and so we went through it. But if anybody's familiar with the Library of Congress, it's built like a gigantic Italian Renaissance palace. It's huge. And so they don't have one exhibit, they have a bunch. And when I walked out, and I led the boys out, I saw there's other exhibits going up there, and curiosity got the better of me, and we went over there to see what was going on. And one of them was about the commemoration of the following fact: the demobilization of the American forces at the end of World War II. There was 11, 12 million men and women in the service all over the world. It's just a gargantuan logistical task, you understand what I'm saying, of how they demobilized everybody and brought them back to this country and then tried to reintegrate them. And I was interested in it. And they had a War Department film. It was very interesting. I still remember it. And they were showing over there from 1945 to 46. And they had this major or colonel talking to a bunch of GIs. And this was a training film. And basically, what he said was along these lines. Now the war's now over, and you're going back home to your mothers, your sweethearts, and your daughters, or something like that, or your sisters. And when you get back, you're going to have a hero's welcome, and everybody's going to ask you what you saw. Here's what you're going to tell them: nothing. You keep a big fat mouth shut. And here's why. The whole reason you went over there and fought this war with all this junk was so that your mothers, your sweethearts, your daughters, and your sisters would not be able to imagine what you ever saw. And it worked. I mean, you hear that. So, married this all together, and yet, in spite of what I just said, the films came out, as we know. Let's take a look at the next picture. And here you see the American Army. It's Eisenhower, of course, going into Dachau. General Patton, who didn't even like Jews. And then they saw this stuff, and it becomes undeniable. I'm not going to show you a whole lot. My purpose is not to horrify everybody tonight. The purpose is to give you a tiny glimpse of what was shown in newsreel films all across this country, in Baltimore and elsewhere, in 1945, which hit everybody like a 2x4 and became an unbelievable moment in the American consciousness and has really governed the American thoughts. It's been a major element in American culture since then. And one person who was emotionally scarred by this, meaning never forgot it, was President Truman, who, as you'll see right now, gave a speech right after these films came out in which he tells the Congress that the United States swears to get the war criminals.
The laws of God and of man have been violated, and the guilty must not go unpunished. Nothing shall shake our determination to punish the war criminals, even though we must pursue them to the ends of the earth.
That's quite a statement from the President of the United States, because after all, why should the Americans go crazy over somebody who killed a bunch of Jews? This is just interesting. This becomes part, as I would say, of the American culture. Believe me, this has become one of the most important elements in the establishment of the State of Israel, without question. This will be, at least in the 1940s, an unanswerable argument, And I'm happy to say, at least in 2011, so far, with the American presidents, it has remained an unanswerable argument. Because there are plenty of people out there who would like to challenge that. And the whole Arab narrative is about challenging that. So far, in the American general public and among the presidents of the United States, this is, Holocaust. You understand? It's quite remarkable. Now, you had all these displaced persons, as they call them. That's a government term for what do you do with all these Jews and others? Where are they supposed to go? There were a ton of people in prison camps and concentration camps and labor forced labor left over at the end of the war. From Poland, not Jews, Poles, Hungarians, Frenchmen, Belgians, you name it. Because the Germans had grabbed huge numbers of people, because Hitler had a labor minister who came up with the idea very correctly. He says, labor is gold. After what do you need the money for? You need money to make things happen. If you have the forced slave labor, it's the same thing. And so the Germans, I'm sorry to say, perfected the art of using slave labor in the 1940s. And if you read up on it, you'll find they did amazing things with slave labor, which is kind of scary. And those people all went home. So in April, May, June, July of 1945, all across Europe, you see whole groups of people, each one either going by train or sometimes by foot, walking home. Where are the Jews going to go? What's home? They don't want to go home. Most of the Jews came from Central Europe and Eastern Europe. First of all, you have the local anti-Semitism still like you had in Poland and Hungary. You're alive, you came back. Second of all, it's now under Stalin. Who wants that? The whole Eastern Europe and the whole Central Europe was occupied by the Red Army and remained that way until 1990. That's part of the Cold War. I don't have to tell you that. If you're Jewish, particularly if you're a religious Jew or a Zionist Jew or a Jewish Jew, you want to go back to a Stalinist-controlled environment, why would you do that? And so more and more, the Jews did not want to go home, and instead they want to go to the American zone. And, here you have Germany divided up. This was the American. In other words, the Allied powers agreed before the war was over that they're going to split Germany up, and this was given to France as a booby prize because the French didn't do anything in the war. But Roosevelt said, "Give them something." But the Americans took Bavaria and this whole southern Germany. The British got this, and this is the Russian zone. As you see up here, this is the whole area occupied by the Soviets, which, of course, they never let go. This is how Europe was divided, of course, for the next 50 years. Where do Jews want to go? The Jews do not want to go there. They don't want to go in the communist part, by and large. Where do they want to go? They don't want to necessarily go here either. What do you want to be in Germany in the Russian zone? Even though I think Buchenwald is over there. But rather, you want to go to the U.S. Army, because that's where you get the best food. And anyway, the Americans will be the most sympathetic, even though I tried to explain at the end of last year that you had a lot of big issues, which I don't want to revisit again, even with the American authorities. But after a month or two, the Americans got their act together and were rather sympathetic to the Jews. And therefore, if you want to understand what 1945 is like, it's Jews from all over the place constantly trying to sneak into the American area. Dachau was over here, Feldafing, where my father was, with the big DP camps. There are other ones, Fernwald. And this is, as I say before, the place where they want to be. The Jewish survivors, as I just indicated, need a process of physical healing. And of course, much more difficultly, they need a process of mental healing. I don't know how that ever went. We all know that many of the people from the war never got through the process of mental healing, which is perfectly understandable. The U.S. Army was not exactly sure what to do, but Truman had a very warm personality when it comes to this sort of thing. I described this all a great deal last year, and he was, without question, scarred. Even in, I don't know if anybody remembers this, when I was a kid, Truman, long after he was out of office, had a TV show for a while called Decision. And it used to be on Sundays. And I still remember, and then I found it last year on YouTube, but I wasn't able to get it for tonight. This was in 1965, 20 years after he was president. He was an old man, and he said, "I still get nightmares from the pictures of the survivors." Understand? So his heart was in the right place, even though politics is, not all about heart. There was no sentiment at all in the United States to reverse the Johnson Act of Exclusion of 1924. And notice the American people saw like this: we have all the sympathy, and they meant it. We have all the sympathy in the world for the Jews. What happened to them was terrible. Survivors need money and help and rehabilitation, all the rest of it. But don't come to America. If they had opened the borders to America, I don't think there would be an Israel. It's just very interesting. So there was, and Truman was part of that. He said, we want to help the people and all this sort of thing, but that doesn't mean that they should come here, and they didn't, right? There were very definite quota laws. Once in a while in the late 40s, Congress would pass a few thousand there, a few thousand there, but it was very difficult, and that was not the way the country wanted to go. As a result, the displaced persons, the Jewish ones, become a Zionist tool, because it goes like this. They're all, as I showed you before, they're all back over here in the American zone. The U.S. Army is feeding them and taking care of them. They don't want to. They say, when can we get rid of this whole business? When can these people normalize the situation? They don't want to go anywhere else. America doesn't want them. The Jews in Palestine say, we want them. Let's send them here. So there's one place in the world that offers a solution. Of course, the Arabs and the others say, well, you just want them in order to build your thing, in order to be able to get independence, to fight the Arabs. And, the Zionists say, no, this is strictly humanitarian. And this means that the DPs, the displaced persons, become a very important political tool, or football, if you wish, in the period I'm talking about, a major element in all the calculations. But to conclude, European Jewry is now not a player anymore, but a recipient of aid. The American organization will try to help them, it's the highest, or the different federations, or, that sort of thing, and each group will send its, in good old American style, each organization will send its shlichim over to Germany to try to help and politically control them in their way, ideologically, but Europe is now the orphan. I might say, well, I'll get to that a little bit later. The other big community, or you might say the one that emerges as a result of everything I just discussed in 1945 as the supreme Jewish community world, right here, the U.S. Jewry, American Jewry, by default, if not anything else. As you know, the United States of America was the big winner in World War II. Yes or no? By that I mean that we didn't lose much at all. The war was not fought over here. Right? What's the U.S. casualties altogether in World War? How many Americans are killed fighting the Japanese and the Germans? Or something like 400,000. I'm not saying it's a little. I'm not 420,000. But the Russians lost that in a day. The Russian losses in World War II killed was something like 20 million. The German losses in battle and things like this was like 8 million if you count all the people killed in the bombing raids and all that. Huge numbers. Second of all, they were fought in Europe. Russia was physically wrecked, the areas where the Germans and the Russians had fought. Germany was physically wrecked. Even England was bombed to bits. America wasn't touched. And to be perfectly honest, as we all know, the war was the best thing to ever hit the American economy. That's what allowed Roosevelt actually to solve the Depression. He wasn't able to do it with all the New Deal business in the 1930s. That didn't work. But the war came along, and all of a sudden everybody had a job, and he had government contracts, and it was what it was. So just like the U.S. emerged almost obscenely as the big winner in the end of World War II, so in its own way, in a parallel way, American Jewry emerged for the same reasons as the big winner if you're looking at power in the wake of the Second World War. The American Jews in 1945, rich, politically influential. There's the death of anti-Semitism. The fact that Hitler had been associated with, of course, anti-Semitism, and Hitler was associated with evil, meant that it wasn't possible anymore, to the degree that it had been possible even before, to be openly against anything Jewish. The late 1940s is, what's the most famous Hollywood picture from the late 40s? Gentleman's Agreement, in which they take on directly the whole question of anti-Semitism, which is something Hollywood never do, and they got Academy Awards for doing. Gregory Peck, by the way, was the big hero. And similar kinds of artistic manifestations of the fact that there's a new political correctness, and really the great era of that kind of liberalism commences with the end of the Second World War. Academia, all the old barriers, if you want to be honest about it, fall after 1945. It used to be that in this university and that university, if you were Jewish, you ain't getting a job. You can count in your fingers the number of full Jewish professors that were allowed in there, regardless of their academic competence, in spite of their academic competence. And this simply is not the case in the 40s and 50s and 60s and afterwards. Now all doors are open. I'm not saying everything turned overnight into paradise for the Jews, but a lot more than had been the case beforehand, and this was associated with the contamination of the idea of being anti-Jewish by associating it with Hitler. It became something you couldn't do. This was, in terms of American Jewish culture, the heyday, 1945, of cultural Zionism, which we've described in the past, and that was the Jewish culture of the vast majority of American Jews, which was going back to Haram, perhaps in its American rendering, secular, or at least certainly distinctly non-fundamentalist, the kind of Jewish culture very heavily associated before with modern Jewish expression, not interested in the old traditionalist, fundamentalist kind of approaches to Judaism. And it was a rich culture. If you went back to Baltimore or anywhere else in 1945, there were tons of organizations and groups that were really active and alive, cultural groups that aren't there today, but they were there once upon a time. American Jewry was beginning a 30-year period in which the cultural Zionism, I'm talking about, would reach its apogee, and then problems would kick in. Although nobody knew it, by the way, it also was, because every action has a reaction, it was also the beginning of right-wing orthodoxy. For the same reason, because those who were going to reject that, those who were going to reject it, were going to become militant and organized in the wake, starting in 1945. I mean, Mendelovitz, right then in 44 and 45, started the Torah Masorah, which, as you know, spread all over the country. I don't have to tell you the importance of Rabbi Cutler as far as Lakewood is concerned, or even Rabbi Soloveitchik. And the Satmar Rebbe is another variation of something that never existed in America, but certainly will become a big and powerful force in American life, Hasidism I'm talking about, in the wake of 1945. It's really a very interesting period in terms of being a watershed of what it projects for the future of American Jewry. Then, 1945 will also be the period of the emergence, for the first time, of a serious political Zionism. I just talked about cultural Zionism, and that's true also, but now become a very important political Zionism. Let me explain for a second. The vast majority of Zionists in America up to 1940s were cultural Zionists, because that didn't involve any kind of politics, and you didn't have to take any kind of a stand. If you believed in Ivrit and belonging to Jewish literary societies, having plays, serious discussions, sending money to Palestine to support Jewish cultural institutions, or the Hebrew University, Hadassah Hospital, the Histadrut, any culture. I mean, that has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli crisis or problems. You're not getting involved in any of that. You're simply supporting positive Jewish values. Reform Jews couldn't even be against that in those days. You understand? As long as Zionism was culturally Zionist, even those who later on became very anti-Zionist among the Reform movement didn't have too much of an issue to say against it, because how can you argue against somebody who wants to contribute, for example, to Hadassah Hospital? Seriously. Right? How can you argue against somebody who wants to contribute to the Hebrew University, or to help Bialik Publishing House, or whatever, or Jewish dance troupe, or homes for orphans from the war? But now, in the wake of the Second World War, the political struggle begins in earnest against the Arabs and against the British for the establishment of a political Jewish state. That's interesting. That never happened before. And American Jewry will be mobilized in very interesting ways, and sometimes polarizing ways, specifically in the years 1945, 46, 47, 48, to battle in public opinion and the halls of Congress and the United Nations and around the world, and use every ounce of strength that they're able to defeat the opposition, and overcome the opposition, and get a state of Israel one way or another established anyway. This already becomes very controversial, because then you open yourself up possibly to charges of dual loyalty, or what's really going on. Are you putting American interests first? I'll just tell you right now, the Truman Administration is going to be a battleground. I'm talking about Truman's first administration. He was in for 2 times. Roosevelt died in April of 45, right after he was elected for the fourth time. In other words, Roosevelt's fourth term began on January 20th of 45. He was dead 2-3 months later. Truman served out that whole term. And then, I'm sure everybody knows, he was re-elected to a second term. But he was re-elected in November of 48. So everything involving the establishment of Israel I'm talking about this year happens primarily in Truman's first term. And the State Department, you know, I don't have to tell you this, the State Department and people like that all said it's against America's national interest to support Zionism, to support anything involving the State of Israel. Usually in the past, the State Department spoke for the American consensus, the American public. To go against what the State Department says, you can do it, but usually it was considered un-American. And yet, in spite of all that, that's exactly the battle that will be waged over the next several years in America. So it means you have a new, self-confident, vigorous, and powerful American Jewry that can, sort of like willing to do this. And I would even say that we're really, therefore, in 1945, entering a period in Jewish history that can be called the Age of American Jewry. I would even to be perfectly honest, I think you'll agree, politically speaking, American Jewry is stronger than Israel. The classic Zionist opinion was that American Jew will be protected by the establishment of the State of Israel. But fate has turned things on its head, and as far as I can tell, it's the other way around. Now, I wish it wasn't, right? I wish you had a strong, powerful Israel, didn't need America. We don't want that, but that's the way it is. The Obama administration, any administration, the fate of Israel lies in these kinds of situations. And Israel doesn't have its own power to get the message across. The American political establishment is looking to American Jewry. We have people here from AIPAC and others, they know what I'm talking about. It's a struggle that has to be waged. And so there's no question that we're entering the age of American Jewry, which is certainly, as I said before, not only stronger than Israel, but I think looking at it as a historian is the most generous in history that I know of. Now, the kind of money that American Jews have raised, and directly and indirectly, it far outweighs the amounts of money you got out of any of the Jewish communities in the past from other places. It's really quite remarkable. Religious, not religious, this, that, and the other, just turn out, and they continue to turn out a ton of money, which if any of you have friends who are not Jewish, and if they ever find out how much you raise every year in the course, besides your tuition payments, how much you raise in the course of a year for this charity, that charity, they'll be absolutely shocked. You understand? That's been my experience anyway. And yet, on the other hand, American Jewry, by and large, is Jewishly illiterate. This will be a very interesting feature of American Jewry in the second half of the 20th century. It's a basic problem of our times. The vast majority of American Jews, and certainly the overwhelming majority of American Jewish leadership, doesn't know that much about Judaism. They can't read a sefer. This was not the case with the European Jewish leadership elites in Europe once upon a time. Even those who were not religious, who were secular, completely divorced from religion, had been either from their family background or otherwise saturated and soaked in the Jewish culture, the whole Yiddish language, everything that goes along with that, so that this Jewish stuff just was absolutely part of them. If you threw out a Yiddish phrase or even a phrase from the Talmud or something like Chaim Weizmann, who was a hugely atheist and super secular Jew, you knew exactly what you're talking about. This is gone, as you and I know, with the vast majority of American Jews, including the American Jewish leadership. And so you have really a kind of a funny situation over here. Chaim Weizmann remarks about this disdainfully in his memoirs when he talks about the first Zionist Congress that emerges after the Second World War, the one that meets in Switzerland in 1946. And he says, well, the most prominent group was the American Jewish group. But this, of course, was only by process of elimination because the real Jewish Jews were all dead. Now, he didn't like the fact, whatever. But there's truth, besides the sour grapes, there's truth to it. You understand? So you have a structurally funny situation. You have a big, a big ignorant fellow who's got all the money. Right? It's hard to explain. Weizmann himself, if you know anything about Zionist history, had a famous speech in which he said in 1921, American Jewry has to choose between Pinsk and Washington. Now I'll tell you the context of this, to put what I'm talking about tonight in proper context. This is in 1921, right after the First World War. At that time, the leader of American Zionism, Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court justice. At that time, he already owned the Supreme Court. Still the head of the ZOA. It was a different America, and Brandeis was an unusual guy. Can you imagine, I was the other day, not here actually, in Bethel, they had Elena Kagan, the Supreme Court justice, and people asked her about her Jewish stuff, and she had to be very cautious, and properly so, about her Jewish interests and things like that, because she's the Supreme Court justice. But if you went back a century or 90 years, Brandeis was the head of the ZOA. And he went to Versailles in the peace conference in 1919, when Woodrow Wilson was the president. He was a member of the Supreme Court, to lobby in favor of Zionism and the Jews should get Palestine and things like this. Could you imagine today a Supreme Court justice doing this sort of thing? And yet he and Chaim Weizmann were very strongly opposed to how Zionism should go. And Chaim Weizmann came to this country and campaigned that he should be the one that the Zionists should follow. And they had, I think in Cleveland, a big showdown, a big Congress, Zionist Congress. And Felix Frankfurter, who was Brandeis' lieutenant, it's a very interesting story. He said, you got to support Brandeis, and we Americans should stick together. And Weizmann said, and this was 1921, he says, American Zionism, American Jewry has to choose between Pinsk and Washington. And they voted for Weizmann. Right? And Brandeis was in Huff, and he resigned and all that sort of thing. Meaning that kind of cultural feeling was there. And of course, in 1946, the American Jews were voting for Washington and not for Pinsk. That's what he didn't like. There were let's put it this way. Is there an American Jewish community? That's an interesting question. In Europe, we had official communities in which people voted, sometimes forced by law, sometimes not, voted for communal leaders. There was a process. You don't have that in this country, especially, in 1945. Before the recent economic downturns. Yeah, but who's the head? Is it the Federation? Is it the American Jewish Committee? Is it the American Jewish Congress? Is it the Zionists? Is it in Baltimore, is it the BZT? Or is it this group or that group? We all know the facts of life. Each group claims to represent the American Jewish community, and none of them were elected. You had this problem already at that time, and yet in spite of what I said, there is an American Jewish community, sort of. It's funny, a phenomenon. There are inchoate feelings among the masses, but there are also self-appointed leaders. But there really were federations, organizations, etc. And one can say, in the 1940s certainly, that there was kind of a connection between the grassroots on the one hand and the official leaders on the other hand, and that they did kind of speak for the majority of American Jews, the masses over here. And everybody was united on the fact that we have to help the deep peace. And that's obviously a consensus issue. I think there was a really basic and perfectly understandable feeling among American Jews that we messed up on the Holocaust, so let's get it right in Israel. Nobody, as far as I can tell, and like I say, I know a fair amount of this, nobody wanted to talk about the war and the failures. That's perfectly understandable. When these kind of things happen, it takes a generation or two to deal with it. And in the 1940s, they just didn't want to talk about all this. But it was it was the elephant on the table. And everybody, as I say, simply felt the Shoah happened, but if we get Israel, that'll somehow or other make up for it. I don't mean make up for it, but you know what I'm saying. Give some kind of a meaning for it. So let's get it right in Israel. There was the all-important switch, from Roosevelt to Truman. That was hugely important. I mentioned last year, I devoted a whole class to this, but Roosevelt was a very great president, but he was very tricky on the Jewish issue, and it's particularly on the Zionist issue. And most historians will tell you that although Roosevelt really, really, really wanted to help the Jews, when he would run up against a solid wall of Arab opposition, he wouldn't do it. That was his general style. If there was strong opposition to it, then he won't do it. At the end of the day, as far as I can tell anyway, Franklin Roosevelt did not have any sense of obligation toward world Jewry. I think he had some kind of obligation toward the American Jews, but the American Jews were doing just fine. What happens to the DPs and the others was important, but not that important. And therefore, most people would say they would not have been in Israel if Roosevelt would have continued in office. Truman was a different business. I always like to mention the fact that Truman was a fundamentalist Christian, but in the 1940s he didn't talk about that. He came from a farm in Missouri and so forth. You didn't wear your religion on the sleeve. But if you take the trouble to study up, you'll see that he read the Bible every day. He'd done it since he's a child. His mother, ran the Bible, and it's Meznaz wrote. And his favorite Bible passage was Psalm 137. That's Al Naros Bavel Sham Yoshavnu V'gam Bachinik B'Zachonos Sion. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and mourned as we contemplated the loss of Zion. So, the good Lord has a sense of humor over there. The meaning when he came in office, Zion, Eretz Yisraelis were not far away concepts talking about somewhere in the Amazon River. These were very well known to him. Truman himself, during his years, up and down, as we'll see, was very sympathetic to Jews, and he was also sympathetic to Zionists, but obviously he had to balance this out with the State Department and the calculated interests of the United States vis-a-vis the Arabs. I can perfectly understand the argument that America shot itself in the foot by supporting Israel and alienating itself with the Arabs. It's a perfectly understandable argument. I'm Jewish, so I don't buy into that argument, but I understand it. And Truman was pushed in two directions. Not every president would have been. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for him to take a principled stand against this, but that's not what he chose to do. It's very important to understand that Truman was a very weak president. If you know him in American history, he was a politically weak president. He was not able to dominate the Congress the way Roosevelt was. He barely got in a second time. He lost in 1946. The Republicans crushed the Democrats for the first time since 1930 and took over both houses of Congress. They overrode his vetoes with gigantic majorities. People don't remember this. The U.S. economy went into a tailspin right after the Second World War because it took about 5 years to get it right, to what to do with the end of World War II, to convert from a military economy to a civilian economy. In 45 and 46, you couldn't buy a refrigerator. You understand? Things like that. And it took a while for this to get, or a car, or whatever, because it took time to retool. There were tremendous labor strikes that were going on over here. There were civil rights problems that were going on over here. Truman, you might say he had his heart in the right place, but he was not able to get any of his programs through. Even when he was reelected, he wasn't able to get programs. He's one of the big, from a purely political point of view, Truman was a big failure as a president. His great achievements were in foreign policy, where he was able to get a consensus among the Democrats and the Republicans, mainly by appointing Republicans to high office and things like that. But all this means is that this was good for the Zionists, because they were facing an administration that was politically always on the ropes and wasn't strong enough to make a powerful case against them. Quite the opposite. This is very important to remember. It's also true that the years 1945-49, there was an absence of an Arab voice in America. You didn't have a large Muslim immigration as you do today. You didn't have competing, for time on the talk shows and the media and places like this. There was very few people in this country that knew anything about the Palestinians, and they were mostly professors and former missionaries and people like this, high hoity-toity elite types who most people had no contact with and wrote in magazines like Foreign Affairs or places like that. Maybe the Quakers, the Presbyterians, they appealed to their majority, but the Jews controlled the message when it came to Eretz Yisrael and to Palestine. And so don't be surprised that the first Truman administration will see a lot of Jewish politicking. And the big leaders of American Jewry at that time were the Zionists and the Federation Machers and the millionaires. It's probably the same today, but that's what it was at that time. Abiel Silver, as we'll see over here, and he's the old, he's the new. Stephen Wise had been around forever. He had more or less failed during the Holocaust, and therefore he lost his moral credibility. This is the new guy, a very famous Reform rabbi from Cleveland, a powerful orator, we'll see before we're done. And this was his moment when he became the head of the ZOA, and will fight all the battles of the federations, the organizations, and he will rally and mobilize American Jewry to fight the battle for Israel. That is what he did. This is the federations. Henry Monter was, I don't know exactly what it's called, but the head of all the federations in America, all the associateds. And he was favorable to the Zionists, and he's the one who got the various federations on board. After all, the federations are there to serve their local communities. They're not necessarily there to get involved in political action and approach their congressmen, their senators, and the others on behalf of the Zionist agenda, which was by no means something that everybody agreed upon, and yet it happened. And so he's there. He's the guy who will raise a lot of the money necessary over there. You know, the people who you don't see so much are actually the ones that get things done. That's been my experience anyway. Now, and of course, we all remember Jacob Blaustein from Baltimore areas with Truman. He's the millionaires and a big oil man, and one of the very few Jewish oil men who are Democrat and vote for Democrats. He will give Truman a lot of money for his re-election campaign in 1948 and things like that. And therefore, Jews like him have a voice. You know, they can get in, and when they make a phone call, the White House, takes the call. And so these are people like they're, in other words, none of them are elected. But that doesn't mean that they're not leaders either. It's totally a function of charisma then, not of institutional power. But they did, in the period I'm talking about, as we'll see before I'm done, have a kind of a charismatic power. Then there's another type of powerful Jew. Okay? And these are the insiders, the ones who actually physically interact with the president. Now, this guy you never heard of, he wanted it that way. David Ells was one of Truman's 3 top assistants. But as was described, he had a passion for anonymity, and that's one of the reasons Truman kept him on. He had been from Roosevelt. He was one of the only people from the Roosevelt group that Truman kept in the White House, and he was his staff man for minority affairs and this and that and the other. And he was a very secular kind of Jew, but he will be somebody who Truman talks to every day. And when he says like this, is he should really do something for the Zionists, or if there's a memorandum that needs to be put in front of the president, all the rest of it, they have a guy in the White House. Okay? Same thing with this guy who really some people heard him, nobody's ever heard of him. Max Lowenthal graduated Harvard Law School, and when Truman, you see how young Truman is over here if you know anything? This is when he was a senator. He became famous by running the Truman Committee in 1940 to 44, in which they investigated the war effort. After all, when FDR cranked the country up to fight World War II, the government spent zillions of dollars. Now you tell me, in American economy or anywhere else, when you're spending billions and zillions of dollars, how much of it is going to graft and things like that across the board? Stuff is going to fall through the cracks, and an enormous amount fell through the cracks in World War II. Truman and his investigation committee probably found 10% of the corruption. You understand? Maybe. And he always boasted, I saved the country $15 billion. Maybe, but that means you can imagine about 100 billion was never seen over there, because that's just the way it was. You had a huge, gigantic war effort, and sometimes you were allowed to investigate, sometimes you weren't. The atomic bomb. The government was creating atomic bomb in World War II, but you're not supposed to talk about it. And all of a sudden the Truman Committee said, there's all this money being spent on this stuff in Tennessee, and nobody knows where the money's going. And he wanted to send investigators there and look into it. And General Marshall, who was the head of the army at that time, called Truman up and he basically said, do you trust me? He said, yes, I trust you. Then don't look. Just take it from me. It's not a politics thing. We're not stealing the money. Don't look and don't talk about it. And Truman said, okay. All right, that's the kind of country it was at that time. I'll tell you another story. When they had to come up with the money for the A-bomb, it was like $1 billion here and $1 billion. That was a lot of money once upon a time. And how do you hide it? The Germans can study the budget and see where you're spending extra money. So you have to bury it in the other things, in the other budgets. And Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the House at that time, and he had this personal charisma also, and he called in 15 committee heads in the Congress and the House of Representatives. And he said like this, don't let anybody ask me any questions. Each one of you is going to put $250 million extra in the budget, and you're not going to touch it. You're going to give it to me. And I don't want to hear any questions about it. And they said, yes, sir. Right? And that was the money went for the A-bomb. So it was a different country at that time. Well, this was his general counsel. When Truman launched his committee, he said to Brandeis, get me some smart Jewish guy from Harvard Law School that should be my general counsel. That's really what happened. And he gave him this guy, Max Lowenthal. So they worked hand in hand. And he stayed in the White House all the way through Truman's administration. Nobody heard about him, but the Zionists knew he was there. Okay? And this is a different type of power. That is to say, the proximity to the top guys. They're not elected by anybody, but they count. This guy, of course, is with a well-known Jewish name. He represents the power of the guy who gives the candidate money. It's as simple as that. Understand? Abe Feinberg, again, it's a very interesting story, and we'll run across him a lot before we're done. These are the names you don't see in the regular history books. This is where the real action happens. I can tell you right now, when Truman is running for president in 1948, his train is going up and down the famous whistle stop campaign, and nobody believes he's going to win, and the money runs out. The contributors don't come in, and he's somewhere in the Midwest, and literally the train stops. This really happened. The train stops. And what do we do with the money? And it was like, bazillionaires. And then this guy steps on board with $2 million. It's really happened. So, which he collected from people for the Democratic campaign. Abe Feinberg was from New York. He and his father made a lot of money selling raincoats. A lot of money. And therefore, at a young age, he already was, independent. And he wanted to have proximity of power. He tried to get into Roosevelt, but he couldn't break that. So he said like this, let me do the vice president. He can't get to president, vice president. And he came close to Truman when he was running for vice president. And then he got really lucky because Truman became the president. And this guy is a super supporter of Israel. And will remain a huge supporter of Israel through Lyndon Johnson. People were surprised a couple years ago when Michael Beschloss published the phone conversations of Lyndon Johnson. This guy's like on every third page. And everybody said, who's Abe Feinberg? You see? This is a different type of power. So it's going to be a very interesting situation, and these are examples of what I mean when I say the American Jewish community is powerful and has a real power. Now, whatever was going to happen to Klal Yisrael, it depends on these types of people. With that, I leave American Jewry and I go to the second surviving group of Jews, Russia. 3 million Jews left in the Soviet Union. What a crazy story. Like the Soviet Union, they're victorious but exhausted. Russia lost 30 million people in the Second World War, maybe more. The country in the eastern parts, in the Ukraine and Belarus, wrecked. The gigantic, gargantuan battles between the Germans on one hand and the Russian army on the other hand, with no quarter given, no holds barred, left absolute devastation. I just showed you 200,000 Jews killed in the Russian army. I don't know how many were wounded, let alone that. The civilians, Jewish civilians, millions were killed in the concentration camps. And yet, once again, the war years, 1941 to 45, were the best years ever under communism for the Jews. Because Stalin, under the pressure of the Second World War, had to bend a little bit. He gave in a little bit to the Christians, and he also had to give in to the Jews. He even allowed them to form what was called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. This was permitted by the Soviet government. And in Russia, it's very funny if you study this closely and not just superficially. There was a ferocious official anti-Semitism combined with a touch of humanity for the sufferings of the Jewish people in the Holocaust, because the Red Army saw this. The Russian character is a very interesting character. I'm not talking about the Ukrainians, I'm not talking about the Belarusians or the Lithuanians, I'm talking about the Russians. Hitler never really got to Russia. Very little, barely. I know it sounds funny to most people, but I think I showed you last year. He got into Belarus and he got to Ukraine. Stalingrad, they stopped him. They didn't really get into Russia proper. The Russian people have a certain sympathy, a human sympathy out there, and they did for the Jews. But it's also, as I say before, messed up by all the official anti-Semitism. Stalin was very anti-Semitic, but Stalin was always too smart to show it. He was much, much smarter than Hitler, a million times smarter, and he was too clever to display it. First of all, the USSR enjoyed massive Jewish support during the Second World War, because everybody knew these are the guys that are killing the Germans, and it's true. You understand? It was the Red Army that stopped Hitler, that's a fact. I was just talking with Howard the other day. If you want to look at it militarily, even if America had never gone into D-Day, the Russians would have beat them on their own. You understand? It's quite remarkable. Second of all, Stalin, who was one of the great monsters of history, was idolized. Look at all the Jewish spies that we know about that worked for nothing, for idealism, for Stalin during the Second World War. I'm sorry, the Rosenbergs and this group and that group and high officials in Roosevelt's administration. Harry D. White was the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury under Morgenthau. He was a Russian spy. These are just facts. We know this now from the decrypts and the NSA. Listening and things like this is quite remarkable. So Stalin was very careful not to indulge his anti-Semitism in a big and broad way, although he certainly did do so. And then you have the really interesting human stories that, come like from a novel. Who was the number 2 and number 3 in Russia? Well, you had Molotov. I'm sure people remember him. and Voroshilov. These are the top dogs under Stalin. They had with him from day one. They're all murderers. They killed millions of people, all the rest of them. They both had Jewish wives. You understand? I think. Yeah, here's Mrs. Molotov. Okay? And, well, let me tell you something. Nobody knows how all this works, and we still to this day don't know what went on behind the scenes in the Kremlin and all the rest of it. But I can tell you this much. This is Mrs. Molotov. She was a big, big shot in the Soviet hierarchy as the wife of number 2 since 1920 or so. When Golda Meir will come as the first Israeli ambassador in September of 1948 and have her first reception, you know, in the Kremlin and all that, Mrs. Molotov will come over to her and say like this, Shalom Aleichem, ich bin Yiddish Tochter. Now Stalin's spies will hear that and eventually she'll get sent to Siberia for that. But on the other hand, in the years 45, 46, 47, 48, there are, at least at the level of pillow talk, right? I won't say Zionist spies because that's ridiculous, but you understand what I'm saying. No, there are Jewish influences. By the way, in 1940, I say you couldn't make this up. Well, you could, but in 1953, when Stalin will, just before he dies, have this whole thing where he wants to kill all the Jews and send them to Siberia and leave them out there without any food, this guy will raise hell and say, you can't do that, there's anti-Semitism. And Stalin will send policemen to arrest his wife, as they did to Molotov's wife, and he'll shoot them. He was a defense commissar. He'll shoot it, they'll run away, and they'll come back and scream. There are those who say, we don't know still today what really happened, how Stalin died, but there are those who say that he came back and they had this whole fight over this Jewish thing, and after that Stalin got a stroke. So all I'm telling you is life is funny, life is strange when it comes to this kind of business. I can tell you Molotov, who was really a severe guy, lived forever. He died in the 1980s at the age of close to 100. He was eventually kicked out of office, but they didn't do anything to him. And there was a guy, Chuev, who was a Russian nationalist, a right-wing nationalist, who interviewed him in the 1970s, I think, or early 80s, when he was real old, asked him what it was like, all the rest of it. And Chuev was an anti-Semite, but he published this. It's in English. I saw it I read it once in a library book. And when it came to the question about the Jews and the state of Israel, Molotov, I was shocked to read it. He says, one should never forget that the Jews are an ancient and honorable race and entitled to a national homeland for their own, And some of this comes together in 1947-48 when Stalin does a about-face and will support the establishment of the state of Israel, even though it makes no sense. So it's a very funny picture in the late 40s, Soviet Union with the Jews. Tremendous anti-Semitism. Right after the war, they start purging all the Jews from all jobs in the government, for example. Things like that. It's also, to add to the complications, oh, by the way, you'll see the 3 Altakakers. These are Stalin, Molotov, and Voroshilov over here. One second. And this is the victory parade. It's victory parade in 1945 after they beat the Germans. And there's Stalin, there's Molotov, there's Voroshilov. There's 3 big machers over there in the government, as you can see. So I'm not just, as I say, talking about nobodies. Then you have the complicated factor that Stalin had taken over Eastern Europe. By and large, the Eastern Europeans loathed the Russians and the communists. I mean, a Catholic country like Poland or a country like Hungary or Romania, they just hate everything. So they really wanted to go back to the old Christian or Catholic and certainly capitalist kind of system. They really don't want to be over there. It's hard for them to even find people who would have joined the communist services. So one of the things Stalin does, very deviously, is use Jewish communists, because they're loyal to him as opposed to the country. And look at it. This was Stalin's guy in Poland, for example, Jacob Berman. He had been a Jewish writer. He converted to communism. His brother was a minister in the Israeli government. Shlomo Berman. Okay? No, this is a guy who is a staunch Stalinist communist and kills a lot of Poles and things like this and shoves the Stalin system down the Polish thing. But when Israel becomes a state in 1948, Poland will recognize them, and they'll even let 150 or something like that, 1,000 Jews leave for Israel because, charity, business. Same thing with this lady. She becomes the number 3 or 2 in the communist hierarchy in Romania. She becomes a foreign minister. Her father's a shaykhid. Her brother is a rabbi. she arranges for him to go to Israel. He's a frum guy. Her whole family was frum except for her. They end up having a show on television. She eventually, by the way, she is killed eventually by Stalin. But she's in an unusual place at this time. What I'm trying to tell you is the 40s are a screwball in that these fanatically anti-Semitic countries have Jewish leadership. Now they're communist Jewish leadership. But in the 40s, when it's still fluid, there's a certain sympathy mixed with hatred for Jewish causes on the part of the Jewish communist leaders, which Israel will be able to take advantage of, at least in the crucial years of 1947, 48, and 49. Then it'll change. But in those years, when it really, really counted, the Israeli or Zionist representative has somebody that they can talk to in Romania, has someone that they can talk to in Warsaw, and there are more than these. I'm not, giving you oodles of photographs over here. Just some famous cases. This guy was really bad. He was very anti-Semitic. He's Jewish, very anti-Zionist also, Wreckage, who will be a super Stalinist. And that's why there won't be many Hungarian Jews that are permitted to leave for Israel when Israel becomes a state in 1949. He was a super anti-Jewish Jew, unfortunately. But this guy isn't. He's a big macher in the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, and he's the guy that will get Israel the weapons in 1948, which allowed Israel to survive. Because no country will give them the weapons, as we'll see, but Czechoslovakia will. And Czechoslovakia has a big armaments industry, and why did they do that? Well, now in 1952, Stalin would have them killed on charges of Zionism. You see? So, Stalin and the Jews, communism and the Jews, it's so complex. It's an enigma wrapped in a riddle or something like that. Anyway, it's a very fluid situation. Later, though, it will harden, and therefore Soviet policy is very unclear in the late 1940s. Officially, of course, they're the best friends of the Jewish people, but Jews overplay their hand. Remember I told you before that he permitted an anti-fascist committee to function in Russia, the Soviet Union, in the 1940s during the war in order to gain support from Jews around the world. And they did come to America and get a lot of big receptions, all the rest of it. These are two famous names. Shlomo Michals was the big actor, a very famous actor, and the Yiddish theater, a communist Jew, but on the other hand, a Jew. And even this guy went back with Lenin. He was a big macher under Lenin and Stalin. At the end of the war, you won't believe this, the feelings must have been among the Russian elites that the Jews were really taking it hard and were really devastated by the war, and this is too bad. They write a memorandum, they and a few other people write a memo to Stalin in which they say like this: why don't you set up a Jewish state in the Crimea? I'll tell you why. This will take the fire away from the Zionists. Second of all, the Crimea had been depopulated because it used to be the Tartars, and Stalin lifted all of them and dumped them in the middle of Asia in the middle of the Second World War. And therefore you have a reliable Jewish thing over there, and it'll be a great gesture. You win a lot of support around the world for all this. Stalin freaked out. He said, this is a Zionist plot, and he had these guys shot. You understand? Well, I said it wrong. This guy had an accident and was run over by a truck. Okay? This guy disappeared, was doing very well, and in the 1980s they found the trial where he was shot and all the rest of it, in 1952. And this began Stalin's purge of the Jewish intellectuals for the crime of being, as he would call it, concerned with the Jewish interest. But that means that communism, Judaism, is more fluid than we would ordinarily wish to think about it. Let me conclude or go on this by saying, in spite of 30 years of communism and communist indoctrination, there was still a lot of Jewish feeling among the Soviet Jews. When Israel would become a state, many Red Army officers. Oh boy, do we have this picture here? Yeah, that'll do. Yeah, that's not the one I wanted. Many Red Army. These are not what I'm talking about. I'll tell you what I mean when I say not what I'm talking about. There were hundreds, I don't know, maybe 1,000 Jewish colonels and majors in the Red Army. That's a lot of people with a big military experience. When Israel became a state in 1948 and they fight the Arabs, a lot of these people will go, stupidly, and tell the Russians, we want to help Israel. We'll go over there, fight for them, and then we'll come back. You understand? Am Yisrael Chai. When Israel became a state, in May 14th of 1948, the next day is a Shabbos in the Great Synagogue. You won't believe this, under Stalin. In the Great Synagogue of Moscow, which is totally run by the KGB, a bunch of guys will come and unfold a big banner from the ladies section hanging down, Am Yisrael Chai. Understand? Golda Meir will be, as we all know, I'm sure that's very well known, will be mobbed by Jewish crowds when she comes for the first time to pay a visit to the synagogue, not that she was from, to the synagogue in September of 1948. Now, all these people will be punished and killed. But there was a mistake. You didn't do that under Stalin. But the fact that they wanted to do this, believe me, Israel, this is a what if. What if Israel would have had 500 officers, 1,000 officers, Red Army, colonels, and things like that, even had generals want to come and fight for Israel? What kind of experience did they bring from 4 years of the most bloody fighting against the Germans? They would crush the Arabs in 10 minutes. You understand? But it didn't happen, as you know. But I'm saying this to try to indicate to you feelings. But Soviet Jewry was, of course, absolutely helpless. I conclude by saying the conflictedness of the Soviet Jewish leadership, the Soviet decision makers rather, not the Jewish, will result in a conflicted policy, as we'll see in 1947, 1948. And the USSR will violently oppose Zionism, but then they will support the establishment of a Zionist state. And then they won't. The conflictedness is built in from the early one. The last community we'll visit tonight, of course, is Eretz Yisrael, the Yishuv, as they called it at that time, which by 1945 was 500,000 people, 550,000. 550,000. There are 1,250,000. There's 1.25 million Arabs. The Jews are outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. This, of course, is going to be the most Jewish community, because it's Israel, they speak Hebrew, and they're committed to Jewish culture of one kind or another. Every other community, by 1945 and afterwards, will cede centrality, cultural centrality to Eretz Yisrael. Rightly or wrongly, appropriately, inappropriately, that's what's going to happen. Certainly, in the wake of the Holocaust, everybody said Israel is going to be the center of Jewish life, and the way they do it over there, that's the way everybody should follow. The Yishuv, by 1945, had clearly created a state within a state. They had their own parliament. The British allowed this. They had a state, they had their own parliament, they had their own government departments for education, for welfare, for labor, for everything. When Israel becomes a state, they will hit the ground running as far as that goes. The bureaucracy was there before the state. And they still remind you of it, you know? No, but seriously, Israel had created an entire structure, medical, health, education, welfare, across the board, but they didn't have much of an army. But this was a mistake, and they will not have much of an army until 1947. They had the Palmach, which was a small group of a couple thousand young kids, most of whom will die in the fighting in 47, 48, 49. You know, that they had, but that wasn't enough. They had the rudiments of an army, what they call the Haganah and all this, but it's, you know, they didn't have weapons, they didn't have training, they have all the rest of it. That's why Ben-Gurion, who emerged as the most important political leader in Eretz Yisrael, certainly from after 1945, will take over in 1946 and says, I want to become Minister of Defense, or Minister of Security, as they call it, Misrad HaBitachon, because nothing's happening and things have to happen. And it won't happen with him overnight either. It was a very, very difficult business to get that straight. There was great prosperity in Israel during World War II, ironically. While the Holocaust was raging, the US and British and the Australian and New Zealand armies used Palestine as a staging base and a rest and relaxation area. If you had a restaurant in Tel Aviv or Haifa, you did very well during the war, because there were all these soldiers and sailors there all the time. That's the bottom line. If you had a business or an industry, the army was always putting out contracts. Israel did very well in that regard during 1945. It was the heyday of labor Zionism and the Gucci Aliyah that we spoke about in the past, where they had sort of handpicked who would they have allowed in their country and others not. So you had a large population of quote-unquote the right kind of Zionist Jews. This will radically change when Israel becomes a state. And then any Jew can come in and they'll have unexpected consequences. But it was all a white population, so to speak, a Europeanist population, a Zionistically indoctrinated population for the overwhelming part, and therefore a fairly disciplined one. It was what the Zionist movement had achieved. It just was too small. Will England give the Jews a state? Well, if not, will we fight? I mentioned last year, and I'll just do very briefly, everybody was convinced, and it may be true, that Churchill was going to give them a state. There are indications about this, there are indications against it, so it's not easy to tell. But Winston Churchill clearly was committed to doing something for the Jews at the end of World War II, although the rest of the British government was totally against it. But Churchill was kicked out of office as soon as the war was over, and instead came in the Labour Party, and all the Labour Party had promised during their election campaign they were going to be pro-Zionist. As soon as they became into power, they switched to totally anti. And then the question is, so what do you do about it? Here, there's the great split among the decision makers. The This guy says get along with the British at all costs, Chaim Weizmann. Don't go violent, don't go the word. Sion b'mishpat tibadeh. You always like to quote that. We'll only win by moral force. Ben-Gurion said, baloney, you got to fight him. Sion b'milchamat tibadeh, I guess. And this guy was always wavering in the middle. He's the second under Ben-Gurion. He's a very important figure in Zionism. He will emerge as Israel's foreign minister when Israel becomes a state. He's number 2. And he really is in the middle between the two of them. And that means there's conflictedness in the fundamental Zionist leadership, the Zionist movement. That's something we're going to see that will surprise you. The Mapam party, which was to the left of the Mapai party, this was the social Zionists, the guys mainly in the kibbutzim, were starry-eyed, unrealistic idealists. It's quite interesting. Up to 1948, they're committed to a binational state. Now, the same guys will fight like lions in the Israeli independence war. These are the guys in the Palmach and the others who will shed their blood right and left. It's very interesting. But as a political party, they were totally into not having a Jewish state. You hear what I said? Not having a Jewish state, instead having a Jewish-Palestinian state. Now, you know and I know that was nuts. But, the whole Zionism was a matter of convincing yourself about a certain version of reality in the first place. Otherwise, you wouldn't engage in this in the first place. They were a perfect example of this. You had many idealists like Martin Buber and others who, for political and democratic reasons, were committed, I repeat, committed to the notion of a binational state. Now, in 1945, the Arabs are totally under the domination of the Mufti and all that. Forget binational, that's not going anywhere. But that's the way they saw it. Ben-Gurion wasn't like this. Shortly after May of 1945, he will very famously go to New York and meet with this guy named Sonnenborn, originally from Baltimore, and he'll say, you get together a bunch of Jewish millionaires because we have to put money together and start getting arms. No, the Ben-Gurion said in 1945, there's going to be a war. I don't care what the other guys say. And I don't know what we're going to do, but we got to start somewhere. Political Zionism now faced its greatest challenge. It was now or never, while the wounds of the Shoah are still raw, before the Arabs really get organized, and most importantly, before the Third World starts to join the United Nations. Because the Third World countries will all be anti-Israel. Some Zionists persuaded themselves as a pipe dream that it wouldn't be like that, but they were crazy. In World War II, Martin Buber, the famous Jewish philosopher, wrote to Gandhi, and he said, why don't you come out with a statement in favor of the Jews, since you have so much international moral power. And Gandhi said, I think the Jews should just not fight the Germans altogether, let themselves all be killed, and this will show the highest madrega of self-sacrifice on behalf of an ideal. So that's the head of India. In other words, you get an idea what I'm talking about over there. There's no way after 1948 or 49 Israel could have happened. Because by then, all the third world countries would start joining the United Nations, and you'd get what you and I know today is the automatic anti-Israel majority. This is what it is. As far as world Jewry is concerned, I conclude by saying he had a structurally unhealthy situation. All the deep cultures in Palestine, but all the money and political powers in the USA. This will actually define the Jewish situation for the next 60 years, will it not? If we suffer through such destruction, though, people felt, we should at least get Israel out of it. That's what the Jewish world looked like, as far as I'm concerned, in the wake of the Shoah in May of 1945. I'll take like 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll close the show. Go ahead. Yeah, there were 1.25 million Arabs, something like that, and about 5.5 million Jews.
Where did the Arabs come from?
They had been there before the Jews. Some came after the Jews. It's complicated, but Lemaisa, there were over 1 million, well over 1 million Arabs. All right, one more? I'm sorry, go ahead. Louder. It's true, but not true. It went up and down. I know there were 400,000 people in whole Palestine in 1840. I'm not going to get into that arithmetic because for our purposes it doesn't matter. In Lamaisa, in the 1940s, there was 1.25 million Arabs in Palestine. I'll take you and you. Go ahead.
You said that there was no Arab voice from 45, 49 in America, and the Jews controlled the message. Did you mean that they controlled the media?
I mean that all the newspapers and by and large, there's exceptions. There were exceptions, but for the most part, the New York Times, the general media, the print media, there wasn't TV at that time, but the newsreels and things like this usually presented the Jewish point of view. That's what I mean. It's not a question of controlling the media, because I don't know how you do that, but it was a fashion to present from the Jewish angle. What was it? You won't believe this. What was the number one? I don't know if you know what I'm talking about even today, but I'll try my luck. What was the number one publication out there pro-Zionist in the late 1940s? The Nation. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a super left-wing anti-Israel thing today. That's an understatement. But Frida Kirchway was the head at that time, and she was persuaded by the Zionist argument. Mainly, she was persuaded by the Holocaust argument. You always get the last word.
The slide on the casualties that you showed at the beginning of the lecture.
All right, these mathematicians and scientists. Go ahead.
It had 5.5 million German soldiers killed and 24 million Russian soldiers killed. I'm wondering why that great disparity is happening.
We talked about that last year. All kidding aside, the Germans in 1941 pulled some amazing military things. Stalin made some gigantic blunders, and 3 times in 1941, the Germans bagged 650,000 Russian soldiers, to give you one example of what I'm talking about. The vast majority, 97% of the